Rome, at the end of the 15th century, at the spiritual center of Europe, where faith was meant to stand above ambition, one family transformed religion into an instrument of rule, morality into a weapon, and power into inheritance. Within the corridors of the Vatican, decisions were made that did not merely shape a dynasty. They redefined how power itself would operate across Western civilization. But this is not a story about villains or sensational secrets. It is a story about a system, about how institutions bend under ambition and the price history pays when power crosses moral boundaries. What began inside the palaces of Rome would leave consequences that endured for centuries, shaping how we understand authority, belief, and responsibility. Rome in the final decades of the 15th century was not simply a city, it was a living archive of power, layered in stone, ritual, and memory. Every arch, every courtyard, every palace facade carried the weight of centuries of ambition, betrayal, and survival. The papacy ruled not merely through doctrine, but through architecture. Space itself became an instrument of authority, shaping who could approach power, who could see it, and who could touch it. Nowhere was this more evident than in the physical environment constructed and inhabited by the Borgia family, whose rise to dominance coincided with one of the most volatile periods in Renaissance Italy. Their story cannot be understood apart from the spaces they controlled, the buildings they reshaped, and the symbolic geography they imposed upon Rome. The Vatican was not yet the marble-drenched monument familiar to the modern visitor. It was a fortified enclave, part palace, part administrative center, part sacred stronghold. Its courtyards, corridors, and chambers were designed not for openness, but for hierarchy. Access was power, proximity was influence, visibility was privilege. Within this spatial logic, Rodrigo Borgia's ascent to the papal throne in 1492 as Pope Alexander VI marked not merely a change in leadership, but a reconfiguration of Rome's internal architecture of power. The Borgia family would inscribe itself onto the physical and political landscape of the city, using buildings as instruments of authority and family consolidation. The papal apartments within the Apostolic Palace, later known as the Borgia Apartments, became the epicenter of this transformation. Decorated between 1492 and 1494 by the Umbrian painter Bernardino di Beto, known as Pinturicchio, these rooms were not neutral spaces of governance. They were ideological chambers, saturated with symbolism, mythological references, and subtle political messaging. The frescoes blended Christian iconography with classical imagery, genealogical allegory, and esoteric symbolism, reflecting the Renaissance fusion of sacred authority and classical legitimacy. Saints, sibyls, prophets, and emperors occupied the same visual field, collapsing temporal boundaries and positioning papal authority as both divinely ordained and historically inevitable. Yet the artistic program of the Borgia Apartments was not merely decorative. It functioned as visual propaganda, embedding the family's legitimacy into the very walls of the papal residence. The choice of iconography emphasized continuity, divine favor, and dynastic permanence. Even as rumors circulated throughout Rome about nepotism, bribery, and moral corruption, the physical space surrounding the Pope projected stability, order, and celestial sanction. Architecture and art worked together to construct a reality that contradicted public perception, creating an immersive environment in which power appeared eternal and unquestionable. Outside the Vatican, the Borgia family extended its spatial dominance through the acquisition and transformation of Roman palazzi. Rodrigo Borgia's children, particularly Cesare and Lucrezia, were not merely political actors. They were spatial agents, embedded into the city's geography through residences that functioned as nodes of power. The Palazzo Sforza Cesarini, later associated with the Borgia family and other urban properties under their control, formed a network of fortified residences that anchored the family's presence throughout Rome. These palaces were not simply homes. They were sites of diplomacy, conspiracy, patronage, and negotiation. Their architecture reflected their function. Heavy stone walls, controlled entrances, internal courtyards shielded from public view, and upper-level chambers reserved for private audiences. The urban fabric of Renaissance Rome was fragmented decentralized, and fiercely competitive. Noble families did not merely compete for titles, they competed for territory, for visual dominance, for spatial advantage. Towers, bridges, and fortified compounds marked the boundaries of influence. The Borgias, newcomers to Italian aristocracy, understood that power required physical inscription. Their Spanish origins, particularly Rodrigo's birth in Játiva, in the Kingdom of Valencia, placed them outside the traditional Roman nobility. Architecture offered a means of assimilation, legitimization, and assertion. By embedding themselves into Rome's monumental geography, they transformed foreign lineage into visible authority. One of the most significant architectural expressions of this strategy was the transformation of the Castel San Angelo into both a defensive refuge and a symbolic extension of papal power. Originally constructed as Emperor Hadrian's mausoleum in the 2nd century, the structure had long been repurposed as a fortress for the papacy. Under Alexander VI, it became more than a defensive stronghold. It became a psychological anchor of authority. Its towering mass, looming over the Tiber, projected permanence and invulnerability. The secret passageway, the Passetto di Borgo, which connected the Vatican to the Castel San Angelo, exemplified the fusion of architecture and survival. It allowed the Pope and his court to flee under siege, reinforcing the sense that papal power was both spiritually elevated and militarily protected. The existence of such architectural contingencies reveals the instability underlying the surface grandeur of Renaissance Rome. The papacy was not a stable monarchy. It was an elective institution, perpetually vulnerable to external invasion, internal rebellion, and foreign manipulation. The Italian peninsula was fractured into competing city-states, foreign powers, and dynastic alliances. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Venice, Florence, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States were locked in shifting patterns of alliance and conflict. Rome, as the spiritual center of Western Christendom, was also one of its most contested political spaces. In this environment, architecture was not merely symbolic, it was strategic. The Borgias' spatial dominance extended beyond Rome into the Papal States, particularly through Cesare Borgia's military campaigns in Romagna. Cities such as Imola, Forlì, Rimini, Pesaro, and Urbino became sites of both military conquest and architectural restructuring. Cesare's approach to governance was not simply military occupation. It involved the reorganization of urban authority, the restructuring of administrative centers, and the consolidation of power through visible, physical presence. Fortresses were repaired, citadels reinforced, and palaces repurposed to serve as instruments of centralized rule. The architecture of these cities reflected the transition from fragmented local lordship to centralized territorial control. The Palazzo Ducale of Urbino, although not originally built by the Borgias, became a symbolic prize of Cesare's campaign. Urbino had long been associated with the Montefeltro family, renowned for their patronage of humanist culture and Renaissance art. By seizing Urbino in 1502, Cesare did not merely acquire a territory, he appropriated a cultural capital, a symbolic inheritance of legitimacy. The palace itself, a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture, represented the fusion of military power, intellectual prestige, and dynastic authority. Cesare's brief control of Urbino illustrated his broader strategy: to replace fragmented noble governance with centralized, territorially anchored rule, supported by architecture that projected permanence. Yet the architecture of the Borgia era was not solely concerned with defense and domination. It also functioned as a theater of spectacle, ceremony, and display. The papal court under Alexander VI was renowned for its elaborate processions, banquets, and public rituals. These events were not mere entertainments. They were political performances staged within carefully curated spaces. The streets of Rome, the halls of the Vatican, and the courtyards of noble palaces became stages upon which power was enacted and perceived. Architecture framed these performances, shaping sightlines, controlling access, and orchestrating movement. The public spaces of Rome, particularly St. Peter's Basilica and its surrounding piazza, were sites of both religious devotion and political symbolism. Although the massive reconstruction of St. Peter's would not begin until later under Julius II, The basilica in Alexander VI's time remained a central focal point of papal authority. Its spatial dominance over the Vatican Hill reinforced the association between spiritual salvation and institutional power. Processions emerging from its doors and descending into the city were not merely religious acts. They were demonstrations of institutional continuity and divine sanction. Yet beneath the grandeur, the physical environment of Rome also bore witness to profound social and economic inequalities. The city was marked by stark contrast between opulent palaces and overcrowded tenements, between ceremonial routes and neglected neighborhoods. The Tiber periodically flooded, spreading disease and destruction through the lower quarters. Sanitation was limited, infrastructure inconsistent, and public health precarious. The architectural splendor of the papal court coexisted with widespread poverty, insecurity, and vulnerability. This spatial inequality mirrored the broader moral and political contradictions of the era, in which religious authority coexisted with worldly ambition and sacred institutions engaged in secular power struggles. The Borgia family's use of architecture thus functioned on multiple levels simultaneously. It was defensive, symbolic, performative, and strategic. It created environments in which power could be exercised, legitimacy could be claimed, and authority could be naturalized. Yet these spaces also encoded the fragility of that power. Fortifications implied threat. Secret passages implied vulnerability. Lavish decoration implied the need to compensate for contested legitimacy. The very structures that projected permanence were built within a political system characterized by volatility, violence, and impermanence. This tension between appearance and reality was not unique to the Borgias, but their story exemplifies it with unusual clarity. Their rise to prominence was rapid, their dominance intense, and their decline abrupt. Architecture became both a tool of ascent and a silent witness to collapse. The palaces they occupied, the cities they conquered, and the spaces they reshaped would outlast them, absorbing new occupants, new meanings, and new power structures. Yet traces of their presence remained embedded in walls, frescoes, urban layouts, and institutional memory. The Borgia apartments themselves would be abandoned after Alexander VI's death in 1503, when his successor, Pope Julius II, refused to reside in rooms associated with his predecessor's scandal and corruption. The apartments were sealed off and repurposed, their frescoes obscured and neglected for centuries. Their physical marginalization within the Vatican complex mirrored the moral repudiation of the Borgia legacy. Architecture here functioned as historical judgment, relegating contested power to obscurity, even as the broader institution continued its operations uninterrupted. This architectural erasure did not erase memory. Instead, it transformed physical space into a palimpsest, layering new authority over old. While traces of the past persisted beneath the surface, the Vatican, like Rome itself, became a city of ghosts, where every corridor and courtyard contained echoes of prior regimes. The Borgias were not removed from history, they were absorbed into it, their presence simultaneously hidden and preserved. To understand the corruption associated with the Borgia family, one must first understand this spatial environment. Corruption did not exist solely in individual acts of bribery, nepotism, or moral transgression. It was embedded in systems of access, patronage, and institutional design. Architecture structured who could approach power, who could negotiate influence, and who could be excluded. The built environment shaped political behavior, enabling certain forms of authority while constraining others. The papal palace was not merely a residence, it was a mechanism of governance. This spatial logic extended beyond Rome into the broader Italian peninsula, where fortified cities, noble palaces, and ecclesiastical complexes functioned as nodes within a vast network of power. The Borgias did not invent this system, but they exploited it with remarkable intensity and efficiency. Their story is thus not merely one of individual ambition, but of institutional vulnerability, structural corruption, and the intersection of sacred authority with secular power. The Renaissance is often remembered as an era of artistic brilliance, intellectual awakening, and cultural renewal. Yet it was also a period of profound political instability, moral ambiguity, and social transformation. The same architectural achievements that symbolize human creativity also testify to systems of domination, exclusion, and control. The palaces, fortresses, and churches of this era were not neutral backdrops to history. They were active participants in its unfolding. In the case of the Borgias, architecture became both a stage and a shield, a canvas and a weapon. It framed their authority, concealed their vulnerabilities, and preserved their memory long after their political power had vanished. To walk through the Vatican, the streets of Rome, or the cities of Romagna today is to move through a landscape shaped by their ambitions and altered by their downfall. Their story is written not only in chronicles and correspondence, but in stone, fresco, and spatial design. As this narrative unfolds, it will move beyond walls and corridors into the lives, actions, and decisions of the individuals who inhabited these spaces. It will examine how personal ambition intersected with institutional structure, how family loyalty collided with moral responsibility, and how the pursuit of power reshaped both public institutions and private lives. But the foundation of that story lies in space itself, in the architecture that framed authority, in the geography that shaped governance, and in the physical environments that enabled corruption to flourish within the heart of Renaissance power. If architecture framed the stage of power, the actors who move within it shaped the drama itself. Rodrigo Borgia's ascent to the papacy was not the result of sudden fortune, but the culmination of decades of institutional maneuvering within a system where spiritual authority and political patronage were inseparably intertwined. Born in 1431 in Xàtiva in the Kingdom of Valencia, Rodrigo entered the Roman ecclesiastical world not as a prodigy of theology, but as a beneficiary of familial networks. His uncle Alfonso de Borja would rise to the papal throne as Calixtus III in 1455, initiating a transformation of the Borgia family from provincial Iberian nobility into central figures of the Roman Curia. This transformation was neither accidental nor unique. It reflected the broader pattern of Renaissance governance, in which family advancement and institutional authority were deeply interwoven. Rodrigo's career unfolded within a church that had long ceased to function as a purely spiritual institution. The papacy governed territories, negotiated treaties, levied taxes, commanded armies, and engaged in dynastic politics indistinguishable from those of secular rulers. Cardinals were not merely theologians. They were diplomats, financiers, administrators, and patrons. Offices were acquired through patronage, influence, and financial exchange. Rodrigo himself became vice-chancellor of the church in 1457, a position he would hold for over 3 decades, granting him unparalleled access to administrative power, revenue streams, and political networks. His longevity in this role allowed him to cultivate alliances across generations of popes, nobles, and foreign powers. The vice-chancellorship was not simply an administrative post, it was the financial nerve center of the papal state. Rodrigo controlled the issuance of papal bulls, the collection of fees, and the distribution of ecclesiastical benefices. Through this office, he accumulated substantial personal wealth and exercised influence over the careers of clerics throughout Christendom. The accumulation of benefices, ecclesiastical offices that generated income, was a standard practice within the church. But Rodrigo's scale of acquisition was exceptional. He held multiple bishoprics simultaneously, drawing income from distant dioceses while remaining physically present in Rome. This concentration of offices blurred the boundary between institutional service and personal enrichment, reflecting a broader structural condition rather than an isolated moral failing. Within this system, the distinction between corruption and accepted practice was often ambiguous. Simony, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices, was officially condemned, yet widely practiced. Nepotism, the promotion of family members to positions of power, was formally criticized yet structurally embedded within papal governance. The very term nepotism derives from the Latin nepos, meaning nephew, reflecting the historical practice of popes appointing relatives to cardinalate positions. These practices were not unique to the Borgias. They were endemic to the institution. What distinguished the Borgias was not the invention of these mechanisms, but their intensity, visibility, and political consequences. Rodrigo's personal life also reflected the tensions between clerical ideals and institutional realities. Despite vows of celibacy, he maintained long-term relationships and fathered several children, including Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. These relationships were not concealed within Rome's political culture. They were acknowledged, tolerated, and integrated into social networks. The existence of papal children was not unprecedented, but their formal recognition and political integration under Alexander VI would become central to the family's strategy of power consolidation. The private sphere thus became inseparable from public governance, with familial bonds serving as instruments of political control. The conclave of 1492, which resulted in Rodrigo's election as Pope Alexander VI, was conducted within this institutional framework of negotiation, alliance, and financial exchange. Contemporary sources, including the diary of the papal master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard, record extensive distributions of benefices and offices in the days surrounding the election. While definitive proof of bribery remains elusive due to the opaque nature of conclave proceedings, the pattern of post-election appointments strongly suggests that Rodrigo secured his election through the strategic allocation of ecclesiastical rewards. This was not an aberration, it was consistent with the political culture of the time. Yet the scale and transparency of the transactions associated with his election intensified perceptions of corruption and moral decay. Alexander VI's pontificate unfolded within a Europe undergoing profound transformation. The late 15th century witnessed the consolidation of monarchical power in France, Spain, and England, the expansion of Ottoman influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the intensification of competition among Italian city-states. The papacy stood at the intersection of these forces, both as a spiritual authority and as a territorial power. Alexander's policies reflected a pragmatic approach to this environment, prioritizing the security and expansion of the papal states while navigating the competing ambitions of European monarchs. One of the most consequential developments of his reign was the involvement of the papacy in the Italian Wars, which began in 1494 with the invasion of Italy by Charles VIII of France. This invasion shattered the fragile balance of power among Italian states and transformed the peninsula into a battleground for European rivalries. Alexander VI initially sought to maintain papal neutrality, but the realities of territorial vulnerability and political necessity soon compelled engagement. Rome itself became a site of diplomatic maneuvering, as envoys from France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Venice, and other powers competed for influence within the papal court. Within this volatile environment, the Borgia family pursued a strategy of dynastic consolidation through territorial acquisition, marriage alliances, and military expansion. Cesare Borgia emerged as the central figure in this strategy. Originally destined for an ecclesiastical career, Cesare was appointed cardinal at the age of 18, reflecting both familial ambition and institutional practice. Yet his temperament and political instincts did not align with clerical life. Following the mysterious murder of his brother Juan, Duke of Gandia, in 1497, Cesare renounced his cardinalate and transitioned into a secular military role, becoming the primary instrument of his father's territorial ambitions. Juan's death remains one of the most enigmatic episodes of the Borgia story. His body was discovered in the Tiber, bearing signs of violent assault. Contemporary sources offered no definitive account of the perpetrators or their motives. The murder exposed the violent undercurrents of Renaissance power politics, where familial bonds, political rivalry, and personal ambition intersected in lethal ways. While later narratives would speculate about Cesare's involvement, no conclusive evidence supports such claims. What is historically verifiable is the profound impact of Juan's death on the family's trajectory, precipitating Cesare's departure from ecclesiastical life and his emergence as a military leader. Cesare's transformation from cardinal to condottiere symbolized the fusion of ecclesiastical authority and secular power that defined the Borgia strategy. Supported by papal resources, French military backing, and a network of alliances, Cesare embarked on a campaign to consolidate the papal states in central Italy. His objective was not merely to secure papal territory, but to establish a dynastic state under Borgia control. This ambition marked a departure from traditional papal governance, which typically avoided overt dynastic succession. Alexander VI's willingness to pursue this strategy reflected both personal ambition and the broader instability of the period in which institutional norms were increasingly subordinated to political necessity. The administrative structures of the papal state facilitated this strategy. The papacy possessed legal authority to invest territories, appoint governors, and command military forces. By granting Cesare titles, territories, and military authority, Alexander VI effectively transformed papal power into dynastic capital. Cities and territories conquered by Cesare were reorganized under papal authority, but administered by Borgia-appointed officials. This fusion of institutional and familial governance blurred the boundary between public office and private interest, embedding personal ambition within the framework of ecclesiastical legitimacy. Marriage alliances further extended the family's political reach. Lucrezia Borgia, in particular, became a central figure in this strategy. Her marriages to Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro, Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, and later Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara were not personal unions but political instruments. Each marriage aligned the Borgias with powerful dynasties, secured territorial claims, or facilitated diplomatic objectives. The dissolution of her first marriage on grounds of non-consummation, the murder of her second husband under mysterious circumstances, and her eventual establishment as Duchess of Ferrara illustrate the intersection of personal life and political strategy in Renaissance dynastic politics. Lucrezia's experience has been heavily mythologized in later centuries, often distorted by sensational narratives of incest, poisoning, and moral depravity. Contemporary sources, however, present a more complex and restrained picture. While she was undeniably embedded within a system of political manipulation, there is no credible historical evidence supporting allegations of incestuous relationships or serial poisoning. Her surviving correspondence reveals a woman engaged in administrative governance, patronage, and diplomacy, particularly during her tenure in Ferrara, where she emerged as a respected cultural and political figure. The contrast between historical documentation and later myth underscores the extent to which the Borgia narrative has been shaped by moral panic, political propaganda, and retrospective sensationalism. The concept of corruption, as applied to the Borgias, must therefore be situated within its historical context. Corruption in the Renaissance was not solely a matter of individual moral failure. It was embedded in institutional structures that normalized the exchange of offices, favors, and resources. The papacy functioned as a political institution operating within a competitive environment of state-building, diplomacy, and warfare. Practices that would later be condemned as corrupt were, at the time, integral to the functioning of governance. This does not absolve the Borgias of responsibility, but it reframes their actions as part of a broader system rather than as isolated aberrations. Yet the Borgias did not merely participate in this system, they intensified it. The scale of their nepotism, the visibility of their dynastic ambitions, and the aggressiveness of their territorial expansion distinguished them from many of their contemporaries. Alexander VI's appointment of multiple family members to key positions, his accumulation of benefits for his children, and his overt support for Cesare's military campaigns amplified existing tensions within the church and among secular powers. These actions provoked resistance, resentment, and political backlash, both within Rome and beyond. This backlash would become increasingly significant as Alexander's reign progressed. The moral authority of the papacy, already strained by decades of political entanglement, faced renewed scrutiny. Reformist voices within the church, including figures such as Girolamo Savonarola in Florence, denounced papal corruption, moral decadence, and the subordination of spiritual authority to worldly ambition. Savonarola's sermons, which condemned the moral decay of the church and prophesied divine judgment, resonated with widespread public discontent. His execution in 1498, following his conflict with Alexander VI, did not silence these concerns. It intensified them, contributing to a growing atmosphere of moral crisis within Western Christendom. The Borgia papacy thus unfolded at a moment of institutional vulnerability when the moral credibility of the church was increasingly contested. The intersection of spiritual authority and secular power created conditions in which corruption could flourish. not as an aberration, but as a structural feature of governance. The Borgias' actions did not create this system, but they revealed its contradictions with unprecedented clarity. As Cesare's campaigns expanded papal territory, they also exposed the limits of dynastic ambition. His success depended not only on military force, but on the continued support of external powers, particularly France. The death of Alexander VI in 1503 would abruptly destabilize this network of alliances, demonstrating the fragility of a system in which institutional authority was subordinated to personal power. Yet even before that collapse, the seeds of instability were evident in the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and dependencies that sustained Borgia dominance. The narrative of the Borgias is thus not merely a story of individual ambition or moral transgression. It is a story of institutional entanglement, structural vulnerability, and the transformation of spiritual authority into political capital. It reveals how power, once embedded within family networks and architectural spaces, could reshape institutions while simultaneously undermining their legitimacy. It illustrates how corruption, rather than existing solely in the actions of individuals, can emerge from the intersection of structural incentives, political competition, and institutional design. As this account continues, it will examine the mechanisms through which the Borgia family consolidated power, the methods by which they exercise authority, and the consequences of their actions for the Church, the Italian states, and European history more broadly. It will explore the campaigns of Cesare Borgia in detail, the political strategies of Alexander VI, the lived experience of Lucrezia Borgia, and the broader institutional transformations that define the late Renaissance papacy. It will also trace the gradual erosion of their power, the circumstances of their downfall, and the enduring legacy of their reign within the historical memory of corruption, reform, and institutional crisis. The military career of Cesare Borgia unfolded within a landscape already shaped by centuries of fragmented sovereignty, where cities rose and fell through a complex interplay of alliances, betrayals, and calculated violence. Central Italy, particularly the region of Romagna, had long existed in a state of political instability. Nominally under papal authority, many of its cities were in practice governed by local dynasties who exercised near-independent rule. These families, including the Riorio in Forlì, the Malatesta in Rimini, and the Montefeltro in Urbino, maintained power through a combination of inherited legitimacy, military force, and negotiated alliances. The papacy's claim to sovereignty over these territories was historically weak, enforced sporadically and inconsistently. Cesare's campaign sought to transform this nominal authority into effective territorial control. Cesare's initial military successes were made possible by the convergence of papal resources and French military support. In 1498, Alexander VI secured French backing by annulling the marriage of Louis XII, enabling the French king to pursue a dynastic alliance with Anne of Brittany. In exchange, Louis XII supported Cesare's ambitions, granting him the title of Duke of Valentinois and providing troops for his Italian campaigns. This alliance exemplified the transactional nature of Renaissance diplomacy, in which spiritual authority was leveraged to secure military advantage, and military force was deployed to achieve dynastic objectives. Armed with French support, Cesare embarked on a series of campaigns beginning in 1499 that rapidly transformed the political landscape of Romagna. His approach combined military force, strategic negotiation, and psychological intimidation. Cities such as Imola and Forlì fell swiftly, their rulers deposed or exiled. Caterina Sforza, the formidable ruler of Forlì, resisted Cesare's advance with remarkable tenacity, but was ultimately captured after a prolonged siege. Her defeat symbolized the collapse of local dynastic resistance and the emergence of a new model of centralized authority under papal auspices. Cesare's governance of conquered territories was characterized by both administrative reform and calculated cruelty. He appointed loyal officials to administer cities, standardized legal practices, and sought to impose fiscal discipline. Yet he also employed violence strategically, not as indiscriminate terror, but as a tool of political consolidation. The execution of local leaders who resisted his authority served as both punishment and warning, reinforcing the consequences of defiance. This combination of reform and repression reflected a broader Renaissance understanding of power as inseparable from coercion and of stability as requiring both order and fear. One of the most revealing episodes of Cesare's career occurred in 1502 in the city of Senigallia. Several of his former allies, including Vitellozzo Vitelli, Paolo Orsini, and Oliverotto da Fermo, had conspired against him, fearing the expansion of his power and the erosion of their autonomy. Cesare responded with calculated deception, inviting them to a meeting under the pretense of reconciliation. Upon their arrival, they were arrested and subsequently executed. This event, widely documented in contemporary sources, exemplified Cesare's mastery of political manipulation and his willingness to employ treachery as an instrument of governance. Niccolò Machiavelli, who served as a diplomat for the Florentine Republic and observed Cesare's campaigns firsthand, would later reflect extensively on these events. In The Prince, Machiavelli cited Cesare as an exemplar of political virtue, not in the moral sense, but in the strategic sense. A ruler capable of adapting to circumstance, consolidating power, and imposing order through decisive action. Machiavelli's analysis was not an endorsement of cruelty for its own sake, but a recognition of the structural realities of Renaissance politics, in which fragmented authority and constant threat necessitated decisive, often ruthless action. Cesare's career thus became a case study in the mechanics of power, illustrating both its potential and its limitations. Yet Cesare's achievements were inherently dependent on the continued authority of his father. Alexander VI's papacy provided the legal, financial, and symbolic foundation for Cesare's rule. Papal bulls legitimized his conquests, papal revenues financed his armies, and papal authority shielded him from external intervention. This dependence represented a structural vulnerability. Cesare's power was not institutionalized independently of his father's office. It was dynastic, contingent, and inherently unstable. This instability became evident in 1503, when Alexander VI fell ill and died unexpectedly. Contemporary accounts vary regarding the cause of death, with some suggesting malaria, others speculating about poisoning. Modern scholarship overwhelmingly favors natural causes, particularly malaria, given the prevalence of the disease in Rome and the symptoms described in contemporary sources. Regardless of the cause, Alexander's death precipitated a rapid collapse of Cesare's power. Deprived of papal backing, he faced immediate resistance from former allies, rival families, and external powers eager to reclaim lost territory. The conclave that followed Alexander's death produced a brief pontificate under Pius III, who died after only 26 days, and subsequently the election of Julius II, born Giuliano della Rovere, a long-standing rival of the Borgias. Julius II was determined to dismantle the Borgia legacy and reassert papal authority independent of dynastic control. His reign marked a deliberate reversal of Alexander's policies, including the reoccupation of territories previously consolidated by Cesare and the systematic removal of Borgia officials from positions of influence. Cesare's political fortunes declined rapidly. He was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually released, only to find himself without the institutional support necessary to reclaim his former power. He sought refuge and military employment in various courts, including Naples and later Navarre, but his ambitions to re-establish a dynastic state in Italy were thwarted. In 1507, he was killed in battle during a military campaign in Navarre, far from the territories he had once governed. His death marked the definitive end of the Borgia project of dynastic territorial consolidation. The collapse of Cesare's power revealed the fragility of dynastic authority when detached from institutional structures. The Borgia family's dominance had rested on the convergence of papal authority, military force, and diplomatic alliance. Once the papacy withdrew its support, the entire structure unraveled. This outcome underscores a central theme of Renaissance governance. Power derived from office was more durable than power derived from personal or familial networks. The papacy, as an institution, survived the Borgias. The Borgias, as a dynasty, did not. Yet the legacy of the Borgias did not vanish with their political decline. It persisted in cultural memory, institutional reform, and the evolving discourse on corruption, authority, and legitimacy. The moral controversy surrounding Alexander VI's papacy contributed to the growing perception of the Church as morally compromised, a perception that would intensify in the decades leading to the Protestant Reformation. While the Reformation cannot be attributed solely to the actions of any single pope or family, the cumulative impact of perceived corruption, nepotism, and moral decay within the Church created fertile ground for reformist critique. The Council of Trent, convened in the mid-16th century as part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, would explicitly address many of the institutional practices associated with Renaissance corruption, including the sale of offices, the accumulation of benefices, and clerical absenteeism. These reforms sought to restore moral credibility to the Church by disentangling spiritual authority from secular ambition. In this sense, the Borgia era can be understood not merely as a period of moral failure, but as a catalyst for institutional transformation. The cultural memory of the Borgias, however, would take a different trajectory. Over time, their story became a symbol of Renaissance decadence, moral excess, and political intrigue. Literary works, operas, novels, and later films would portray the family as embodiments of corruption, often exaggerating or inventing elements of scandal. These representations, while powerful, frequently diverge from historical evidence, substituting sensationalism for nuanced analysis. The persistence of these myths reflects not only the dramatic appeal of the Borgia story, but also the enduring human fascination with the intersection of power, morality, and transgression. Yet beneath the layers of myth lies a historically verifiable narrative of institutional entanglement, structural vulnerability, and political transformation. The Borgias did not invent corruption within the Church, nor did they alone undermine its moral authority. They operated within a system that incentivized the fusion of spiritual and secular power, and they exploited that system with exceptional effectiveness. Their actions exposed the contradictions of an institution attempting to govern both souls and territories, to embody both divine authority and worldly power. The story of the Borgias thus serves as a lens through which to examine broader historical processes. It reveals how institutions evolve under pressure, how power consolidates and collapses, and how moral authority can be compromised by political necessity. It illustrates the limitations of dynastic ambition within institutional frameworks, and the resilience of institutions in the face of individual excess. Lucrezia Borgia's later life in Ferrara provides a particularly instructive example of this dynamic. After her marriage to Alfonso d'Este in 1502, she assumed the role of Duchess of Ferrara and became deeply involved in the cultural and administrative life of the court. Contemporary correspondence and records indicate that she exercised significant authority in governance, patronage, and diplomacy, particularly during periods when her husband was absent. She patronized artists, poets, and scholars, contributing to the cultural flourishing of the Este court. Her reputation in Ferrara was markedly different from her portrayal in later popular culture, reflecting a historical reality that was more complex and restrained than the sensational narratives that would later dominate her legacy. Lucrezia's experience illustrates how individual lives can be shaped by institutional structures and how reputations can be transformed by historical memory. She was neither the passive victim nor the malevolent conspirator of popular legend, but a political actor navigating the constraints and opportunities of her environment. Her life underscores the intersection of gender, power, and reputation in Renaissance society, where women of noble status were often deployed as instruments of dynastic strategy, yet could also exercise significant agency within constrained roles. The institutional consequences of the Borgia era extended beyond the papacy into the broader political landscape of Italy. The consolidation of papal authority in central Italy under Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia would be continued, albeit under different leadership and with different objectives, by subsequent popes. Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope, would further expand and consolidate the papal states through military campaigns, while also initiating major artistic projects, including the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica and the commissioning of works by Michelangelo and Raphael. These developments illustrate how the papacy, as an institution, absorbed the lessons of the Borgia era while redefining its relationship to power, art, and authority. The architectural and cultural legacy of the Borgias thus persists not only in physical structures, but in institutional trajectories. The Vatican's transformation into a monumental center of artistic patronage and political authority cannot be disentangled from the power struggles, reforms, and crises of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The spaces once inhabited by the Borgias would later be repurposed, reimagined, and reinterpreted, reflecting the evolving identity of the papacy and its relationship to history. As this narrative moves toward its conclusion, it will examine the long-term implications of the Borgia era for the Church, for European political culture, and for the historical understanding of corruption and reform. It will explore how the memory of the Borgias has been constructed, contested, and transformed over time, and how that memory continues to shape perceptions of Renaissance power. It will also consider how institutional structures can both enable and constrain individual ambition, and how the pursuit of power, once embedded within systems of governance, can reshape institutions in ways that endure long after individual actors have vanished. The story of the Borgias is thus not a closed chapter of history, but an ongoing dialogue between past and present, between memory and evidence, between myth and documentation. It invites reflection not only on the specific actions of a single family, but on the broader dynamics of power, authority, and morality that continue to shape human institutions. It reveals how corruption, rather than being a deviation from institutional norms, can emerge from their very design, and how reform, rather than being an external imposition, can arise from the recognition of structural vulnerability. With the collapse of Cesare Borgia's territorial ambitions and the removal of the family from positions of institutional dominance, the papacy entered a new phase of consolidation under leaders determined to restore both political stability and moral authority. Yet the memory of the Borgia era did not dissipate with the change of leadership. Instead, it lingered as a reference point, shaping reformist discourse, cultural memory, and institutional self-understanding for generations. The transition from the Borgia papacy to the reform-minded leadership of Julius II and his successors was not merely a smena of rulers. It was a recalibration of the relationship between spiritual authority and secular power. Julius II's pontificate, beginning in 1503, represented both continuity and rupture. Like Alexander VI, Julius pursued territorial consolidation, military expansion, and artistic patronage. Yet unlike his predecessor, he framed these pursuits as expressions of institutional authority rather than dynastic ambition. His campaigns to reclaim and expand the Papal States were justified not as personal projects, but as necessary acts of ecclesiastical governance. In this distinction lay a crucial shift. Power was reattached to office rather than family, to institution rather than dynasty. This reorientation reflected a recognition of the vulnerabilities exposed by the Borgia era, particularly the fragility of authority when it becomes entangled with personal lineage. The architectural projects initiated under Julius II, most notably the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica and the commissioning of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, exemplified this shift. These monumental works were not merely expressions of personal taste or prestige, they were statements of institutional permanence, continuity, and divine legitimacy. The papacy sought to inscribe its authority into stone and paint in ways that transcended individual pontificates. In contrast to the Borgia apartments, which were associated with a specific family and a contested legacy, the new artistic projects were framed as universal, timeless expressions of ecclesiastical power. Yet the institutional memory of the Borgia era persisted beneath these transformations. The mechanisms of governance that had enabled Alexander VI's consolidation of power, patronage networks, benefice distribution, diplomatic negotiation, and military engagement, remained integral to papal administration. What changed was not the existence of these mechanisms, but the degree to which they were overtly personalized. The papacy did not abandon political engagement, it reframed it. This reframing was both strategic and symbolic, seeking to restore the moral credibility of the office while maintaining its political efficacy. The broader church, however, continued to grapple with the consequences of institutional corruption. The late 15th and early 16th centuries witnessed growing dissatisfaction with ecclesiastical practices, particularly among clergy, theologians, and lay reformers. Criticism focused on simony, pluralism, absenteeism, and the perceived moral laxity of church leadership. The Borgia papacy, with its overt nepotism and dynastic ambition, became a touchstone in these critiques, frequently cited as evidence of institutional decay. This perception contributed to the climate of disillusionment that would culminate in the Protestant Reformation beginning in 1517. Martin Luther's critique of indulgences, clerical corruption, and papal authority did not arise in a vacuum. It emerged from a broader context of institutional vulnerability, moral disillusionment, and theological debate. While Luther's grievances were rooted in doctrinal concerns, they resonated with widespread frustration over the perceived gap between the Church's spiritual ideals and its institutional practices. The memory of the Borgia era, though not the sole cause, formed part of the historical backdrop against which these critiques gained traction. It symbolized the entanglement of sacred authority with worldly ambition and the resulting erosion of moral credibility. The Catholic response to these challenges would take shape through the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, which sought to address both doctrinal and institutional reform. The council enacted measures to regulate the distribution of benefices, enforce clerical residence, improve the education of clergy, and reaffirm the moral responsibilities of church leadership. These reforms were not direct reactions to the Borgia papacy alone, but they reflected a broader recognition of the systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed corruption to flourish. In this sense, the Borgia era can be understood as part of a longer trajectory of institutional crisis and reform, rather than as an isolated episode of moral failure. Yet the historical legacy of the Borgias extends beyond institutional reform into the realm of cultural memory and representation. Over the centuries, their story has been retold, reinterpreted, and reshaped through literature, art, and popular culture. From early modern pamphlets and chronicles to 19th century historical novels and 20th century films, the Borgias have been portrayed as archetypes of Renaissance decadence, intrigue, and moral transgression. These representations often emphasize sensational elements, poisonings, incest, secret plots, while minimizing or distorting the structural and institutional context in which the family operated. This process of mythologization reflects both the dramatic appeal of the Borgia narrative and the broader cultural fascination with the intersection of power and morality. The family's story provides a compelling framework through which to explore themes of ambition, corruption, loyalty, betrayal, and decline. Yet the persistence of these myths has also obscured the historical realities of the period, substituting moral caricature for nuanced analysis. The challenge for historical scholarship has been to disentangle evidence from legend, to reconstruct the Borgias not as embodiments of evil, but as historical actors operating within specific institutional and cultural constraints. Modern scholarship has increasingly emphasized this contextual approach. Historians such as Ferdinand Gregorovius, Sarah Bradford, Michael Mallet, and Christine Shaw have sought to situate the Borgias within the broader political, social, and institutional landscape of Renaissance Italy. Their work reveals a family whose actions, while often ruthless and ethically troubling, were not exceptional within their historical context. They were neither uniquely corrupt nor uniquely virtuous. They were participants in a system that normalized the fusion of spiritual authority and secular power. This recognition does not absolve them of responsibility, but it reframes their legacy as symptomatic rather than singular. The architectural remains of the Borgia era provide a particularly tangible lens through which to examine this legacy. The Borgia apartments, once sealed and neglected, were rediscovered and restored in the 19th century, becoming part of the Vatican museums. Their frescoes, once symbols of contested authority, are now objects of scholarly study and public admiration. The spaces that once housed papal power have been transformed into sites of historical reflection, where visitors encounter not only artistic achievement, but also the layered memory of institutional transformation. This transformation of space mirrors the broader process by which historical narratives evolve, shifting from moral judgment to contextual understanding. Similarly, the cities and territories once governed by Cesare Borgia bear the imprint of his campaigns in their urban layouts, fortifications, and administrative structures. While his dynastic ambitions ultimately failed, his efforts to centralize authority and impose administrative order left enduring marks on the political geography of central Italy. These marks would later be absorbed into the evolving structures of the Papal States and eventually the modern Italian state. In this sense, the Borgia era contributed not only to institutional crisis, but also to institutional development, shaping the trajectory of governance in ways that extended beyond the family's political lifespan. Lucrezia Borgia's posthumous reputation offers another example of the interplay between historical reality and cultural memory. During her lifetime, particularly in Ferrara, she was respected as a patron of the arts, an administrator, and a diplomatic intermediary. Yet subsequent generations transformed her into a symbol of moral corruption, often attributing to her crimes and transgressions unsupported by historical evidence. This transformation reflects broader cultural anxieties about female power, sexuality, and agency, as well as the tendency to personalize institutional corruption by projecting it onto individual figures. The contrast between historical documentation and later representation underscores the importance of critical historical methodology in reconstructing the past. The story of the Borgias thus reveals not only the dynamics of Renaissance power, but also the processes through which history is remembered, interpreted, and reimagined. It illustrates how narratives of corruption can become detached from their institutional context, transforming complex historical actors into moral archetypes. It also demonstrates how institutional reform can emerge not from the eradication of power, but from its reconfiguration, from the recognition of structural vulnerability, rather than the condemnation of individual excess. As this documentary approaches its conclusion, it will synthesize these themes, examining the long-term implications of the Borgia era for the Church, for European political culture, and for the historical understanding of corruption, authority, and reform. It will reflect on how the fusion of spiritual and secular power shaped the trajectory of Western institutions, and how the tensions revealed during the Renaissance continue to resonate in modern governance. It will also consider how historical memory, shaped by myth, morality, and evidence, continues to influence contemporary perceptions of power and legitimacy. The Borgias were not merely a family of ambition and controversy. They were a lens through which the contradictions of Renaissance power become visible. Their rise and fall illuminate the structural conditions under which corruption flourishes, the vulnerabilities of institutions that govern both souls and territories, and the enduring challenge of reconciling moral authority with political necessity. Their story invites not only judgment but understanding, not only condemnation but reflection. The final legacy of the Borgia family cannot be measured solely by the territories they conquered, the offices they held, or the scandals that followed them. It must also be understood through the quieter, more enduring transformations they precipitated within the institutional culture of the papacy and the broader political imagination of Europe. The Borgia era exposed with unusual clarity the structural tensions inherent in a religious institution that functioned simultaneously as a spiritual authority and a territorial power. These tensions did not disappear with the family's fall. They became embedded within the evolving architecture of church governance, shaping reform, memory, and the future of institutional legitimacy. By the early 16th century, the papacy had emerged from the turbulence of the Italian wars as a more territorially consolidated, administratively centralized, and culturally monumental institution. This consolidation owed much to the policies of popes such as Julius II and Leo X, who pursued military expansion and artistic patronage on a scale that transformed Rome into a global center of culture and power. Yet the foundations of this transformation had been laid during the Borgia era, when the mechanisms of territorial governance, diplomatic engagement, and institutional control were tested, strained, and reconfigured. The Borgias did not invent the political papacy, but they accelerated its evolution, revealing both its potential and its vulnerabilities. One of the most significant consequences of the Borgia era was the gradual redefinition of the relationship between office and family. While nepotism did not disappear after Alexander VI, its overt dynastic expression became increasingly controversial. Subsequent popes continued to appoint relatives to positions of influence, but they did so within a growing awareness of institutional scrutiny and public perception. The very visibility of Borgia nepotism had rendered the practice politically costly, contributing to a shift toward more restrained, bureaucratic forms of governance. This shift did not eliminate patronage, it transformed it, embedding it within administrative structures rather than familial networks. This transformation reflects a broader pattern in the history of institutions. Crises of legitimacy often produce not immediate reform, but gradual adaptation. The papacy did not renounce political power after the Borgia era, it re-articulated it. Authority was increasingly framed in terms of institutional continuity rather than personal lineage, and legitimacy was sought through visible acts of reform, artistic patronage, and doctrinal clarification. The monumental projects of the High Renaissance, including the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica and the codification of Catholic doctrine at the Council of Trent, can be understood not only as expressions of religious devotion, but also as responses to a crisis of credibility that had been intensified during the Borgia papacy. The cultural memory of the Borgias, however, would follow a different trajectory. While institutional governance evolved toward greater restraint, popular narratives increasingly fixated on the family as symbols of corruption, decadence, and moral transgression. This divergence between institutional memory and cultural representation reveals a fundamental tension in historical understanding: the tendency to personalize systemic problems by attributing them to individual actors. In doing so, broader structural conditions recede into the background, replaced by moralized narratives of villainy and virtue. The Borgias became convenient embodiments of institutional decay, allowing later generations to externalize corruption rather than confront its structural origins. This process of personalization is evident in the proliferation of literary and artistic representations of the Borgias from the 17th century onward. Early modern pamphlets and histories often emphasized sensational aspects of their story, while 19th century Romantic and Gothic literature transformed them into archetypes of Renaissance depravity. These narratives, while compelling, often lacked grounding in primary sources, relying instead on rumor, exaggeration, and retrospective moral judgment. The result was a cultural legacy that bore little resemblance to the historical realities documented in contemporary correspondence, administrative records, and diplomatic reports. Modern historical scholarship has sought to correct this imbalance by reconstructing the Borgias within their institutional and cultural context. This reconstruction does not sanitize their actions or deny the ethical implications of their conduct. Rather, it situates those actions within a system that normalizes the fusion of spiritual authority and political ambition. It reveals how corruption, rather than being an anomaly, can become embedded within institutional design, shaping behavior not through individual malice, but through structural incentive. In this light, the Borgias emerged not as aberrations, but as products of a system that had evolved to accommodate and even reward the entanglement of sacred office and secular power. This perspective has significant implications for how history is interpreted and remembered. It challenges the notion that institutional reform can be achieved solely through the removal of corrupt individuals. Instead, it emphasizes the necessity of structural transformation, of reconfiguring the incentives, norms, and practices that shape institutional behavior. The reforms of the Counter-Reformation, particularly those enacted at the Council of Trent, can thus be understood not merely as responses to doctrinal dispute, but as attempts to address the structural vulnerabilities that had allowed corruption to flourish. These reforms sought to redefine clerical identity, enforce moral discipline, and reassert the spiritual mission of the Church within a framework of institutional accountability. Yet even as the Church pursued reform, the legacy of the Borgia era continued to influence perceptions of papal authority. The memory of corruption, whether historically grounded or culturally exaggerated, cast a long shadow over subsequent pontificates. This shadow did not vanish with institutional reform. It persisted as a cautionary narrative, a reminder of the potential consequences of unchecked power and moral compromise. In this sense, the Borgias function not only as historical actors, but as moral symbols, shaping the collective imagination of power, legitimacy, and decline. The architectural spaces associated with the Borgias offer a particularly evocative medium through which to examine this legacy. The Borgia apartments, once sealed and marginalized, now stand as restored monuments within the Vatican museums. Their frescoes, once instruments of dynastic propaganda, are now objects of historical reflection, inviting visitors to contemplate the intersection of art, power, and memory. These spaces embody the transformation of contested authority into historical artifact, of political ambition into cultural heritage. They remind us that institutions outlive individuals, and that the meanings of spaces evolve as power shifts and memory transforms. Similarly, the territories once governed by Cesare Borgia bear traces of his administrative reforms and military campaigns, even as their political identities have been reshaped by subsequent historical developments. The fortifications he strengthened, the administrative centers he reorganized, and the legal structures he imposed contributed to the long-term evolution of governance in central Italy. While his dynastic ambitions ultimately failed, his efforts to centralize authority and impose order left enduring marks on the political landscape, illustrating how even unsuccessful projects of power can produce lasting institutional consequences. Lucrezia Borgia's legacy, too, reflects this interplay between historical reality and cultural memory. Her life illustrates the complexities of female power in a patriarchal society, where women of noble status were often deployed as instruments of dynastic strategy, yet could also exercise significant agency within constrained roles. Her administrative competence, cultural patronage, and diplomatic engagement in Ferrara challenged the sensational narratives that have long dominated her reputation. In recovering these aspects of her life, modern scholarship not only corrects historical misrepresentation, but also broadens our understanding of gender, power, and agency in the Renaissance. The story of the Borgias thus invites a broader reflection on the nature of corruption itself. Corruption is often understood as a deviation from institutional norms, a moral failing that can be corrected through the removal of corrupt individuals. Yet the Borgia era reveals a more complex reality in which corruption emerges from the very structure of institutions, from the incentives, practices, and norms that shape behavior. In such contexts, corruption is not an exception, but a systemic condition, sustained by the alignment of personal ambition with institutional opportunity. Addressing such corruption requires not merely moral condemnation, but structural reform, a reconfiguration of the relationship between power, authority, and accountability. This insight extends beyond the historical context of the Renaissance papacy into broader considerations of governance, both past and present. The tension between moral authority and political power, between institutional mission and personal ambition, remains a persistent challenge in human societies. The Borgia story offers not a cautionary tale of individual depravity alone, but a case study in institutional vulnerability, illustrating how power can distort purpose and how reform must address structure as well as behavior. As this documentary concludes, it is important to return to the spaces with which it began, the palaces, corridors, and chambers that frame the exercise of power. These spaces, once instruments of authority, now serve as repositories of memory, inviting reflection on the passage of time, the transformation of institutions, and the enduring complexity of human ambition. The Borgias once moved through these spaces as rulers, patrons, and strategists. Today, they move through them as historical figures, their presence preserved not in power, but in memory, not in command, but in contemplation. The secret history behind the Borgia family is thus not a story of hidden crimes or forbidden transgressions alone. It is a story of institutional entanglement, structural vulnerability, and historical transformation. It reveals how power, once embedded within family networks and architectural spaces, can reshape institutions while simultaneously undermining their legitimacy. It shows how corruption, rather than being an anomaly, can become a structural feature of governance, and how reform, rather than being an external imposition, can emerge from the recognition of that vulnerability. In the end, the Borgias were neither demons nor saints, neither uniquely corrupt nor uniquely virtuous. They were historical actors navigating a world defined by instability, competition, and transformation. Their legacy lies not only in the scandals that surround their name, but in the institutional consequences of their actions, the reforms they precipitated, and the enduring questions they raise about power, authority, and morality. Their story endures not because it is sensational, but because it is structural, not because it is scandalous, but because it is human.